Hello, I'm David Holbrook. I'm Festival Director of Mountain Film and Telluride. Welcome to Minds of Mountain Film. I'm sitting here with Kathleen Dean Moore. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you. How are you?
Great to have you here in Telluride, huh?
Oh, it's quite a place.
I'm glad you were here long ago.
I was here about 35 years ago and we all were hippies and it was a different kind of place.
It's changed, but it's still got some of that sensibility, I hope.
It does, and it still has these amazing mountains and these interesting people.
Yeah, well, we try and bring them in for mountain film, and you're certainly one of them.
Well, thank you.
And, when I read that, your interview, that if your house is on fire interview, I said, wait, this is a woman we have to come speak at our climate symposium, our climate solutions symposium. And we did that yesterday, and I felt you really brought a lot to that and changed a lot of what we were thinking about, sort of external to internal.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about how we're going to do this, how are we going to make the great turning, and you had asked me to talk about why. Why do we have to do that? What's the moral urgency of the situation? So it seemed that the audience was interested in that sort of questions as well.
And what is the moral urgency? I mean, elaborate on that.
We've been thinking a long time with a lot of the leaders around the nation and around the world, the moral leaders, asking them, do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in possibilities as our own? And what we're trying to do is create a national discourse around the moral urgency that's as robust as the national discourse around the science.
Sure.
Because of course we need to know the facts of climate change, but that's not enough. We also need to know the moral consequences of letting this all spin out of control. And of course the consequences are huge. They have to do with justice. They have to do with human rights. We have duties of compassion that we're utterly failing in. Yesterday at the conference I was talking about a failure of reverence. Doesn't matter whether you believe that God created the world or whether you believe it was created by the creative urgency of the universe, all the same it's an extraordinary, beautiful, irreplaceable, astonishing place. And that calls for a certain response of reverence and respect. And then I talked finally about the duties to our children and the promises we make to them when we hold them in our arms. I will always love you. I will keep you safe. And if we don't act on climate change, we are betraying that kind of trust, the trust of the children. Because the scientists are now telling us that by the time these babies are in middle age, the life support systems of the planet will be irretrievably damaged. So you put together that fact with the innocence of the babies in your arms, and you have to act. That's a moral urgency that strikes home.
Very much so, as a parent, as a human being.
Yeah.
Jim Balog today said that he gets depressed usually once a day about climate change. And I find that too, that sometimes I have and it's not just climate, because, I mean, climate leads to so many other things.
Oh yeah.
Diseases and hunger and pine beetles and so on. And I think there is something existentially very challenging about this. If you just look under the hood, it doesn't, I think there's a way to surface along and ignore it on some level, but then you're missing out on something else. But how do we deal with that?
Well, it's tough. I agree. Aldo Leopold, the great conservationist, some time ago said the cost of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. But coming here, it makes it clear that that's just not the case. Yeah, if we know about what's going on, we are aware that we live in a world of wounds, but we're not alone. And our concern brings us into a community of caring that is an effective, joyous, intelligent, active community like the one you assemble here. And so Barbara Kingsolver says, we get weary, but when we get up in the morning, we have to put our hope back on again with our shoes and just keep going. And being part of the communities of people who really know and really care and are really acting, that lifts you up. You know that even if you're tired and your voice gives out, there's a whole group of people out there carrying the tune, and that when they get weary, you'll be ready again to pick up.
An old professor of mine said about my films that she found hopeful but not naive. And I like that. I realized that was a space I wanted to live in. What do you think of that?
I think that's a really important point. Naive hope is a very dangerous thing because it leads to moral abdication. If everything's going to be fine, regardless of what I do, then I'm not called to do anything. I can just live my life the way I want. So naive hope, I think, leads us to an irresponsibility that's just not tolerable these days. On the other hand, The blinding despair is easily as disempowering. And the notion that no matter what I do, it's not going to make any difference, and so why should I bother? That's a moral abdication too. So we got hope on one side and despair on the other, but in between them we have this beautiful moral ground on which we can live, and it's called moral integrity. That no matter what's going to happen, how effective I can be, maybe I can't save the world, but at least I can do what's right because it's right. And that creates a kind of empowerment that I think is going to carry us forward. We live gratefully because we believe this world is a gift. And we live simply because we don't believe in taking more than our fair share. And we do what's right because it's right, whether or not it's going to stop climate change in its tracks. So no, I don't believe in hope, but I don't believe in despair either. I believe in action.
Yeah, I mean, and we did a symposium 2 years ago. This year was climate solutions, but we did a symposium 2 years ago on that I called awareness into action. Mm-hmm. And it kind of like programmatically, it kind of worked. There was some really good stuff, but the idea was really, that if you know something, do something. But I felt there was a really long walk from that knowing to doing. That we know that something is bad for the environment. We know that something is bad for us, yet doing it is it's a long walk. Do you agree?
Yeah, Western capitalist Enlightenment culture has thought about knowledge as power. The reason why we go out and try to figure out how the world works is so that we can control it and we can turn it to our ends. But in other cultures, indigenous cultures all around the world, knowledge means responsibility. And the community invests in your knowledge. They invest in your coming to be a person of wisdom. And in return, you owe them the responsible action. So it would be interesting to think about knowledge in a different way now, as calling to us. Knowledge imposes a duty on us to act.
I think that's right, but sometimes making those, I still think it's a long walk. I wish it weren't so long, but I hope that I hope that what we bring here at Mountain Film changes that. I hope there's a lot of things that you're writing. Your book here, may I hold up? Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril. Tell me about this book. They're essays. You assembled it, and it's got a foreword by Desmond Tutu. Tell me about the book.
Yeah, we've been watching scientists step up and increase our knowledge and say, if people only knew, if they only knew, then they would act. This is alluding to your former question. Sure. I think that's one of the saddest statements in the history of the human race. If people only knew, then they would act, because it isn't true. Knowledge alone doesn't move you to action, and here's where the logician in me comes out. Because any argument that has a conclusion that we ought to do something is going to have two premises. One is factual, scientific, this is the way the world is. And the other is value-laden. This is what we want. This is what we seek. This is what we value. This is what we hold worthy. And when you know the way the world is, and when you know the way you would like it to be, where you affirm the value of it, then you know what you ought to do. So we're trying to create with this book a consensus, a moral consensus about action that is as strong as the climate consensus, a scientific consensus about climate. So we asked 100 of the world's moral leaders, people whose names you would recognize, Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, the popes, a number of writers, all to give us, in 2,000 words or less, their best answer to this question. Why do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in possibilities as our own? And we got back incredible responses, or if we didn't get back a response, we went out and found one in their other writings and put together a book that's just rich in all these different arguments for why we have an obligation to the future, why it's wrong to wreck the world. So it doesn't matter your worldview. You could be a Christian, you could be a Muslim, you could be any kind of worldview that you want to hold. We'll find a reason why you need to act. It's an amazingly affirmative book.
Nice.
Yeah.
We need that.
It is.
Affirmation, I think, goes a long way.
Here's what we could be. It's an ethic of affirmation instead of an ethic of scolding and control.
I have this. I was born in 1965, so I got the sort of last third of the 20th century. And I have this theory that if you got sort of that second half of the 20th century, you got a time when so much was possible. We didn't have the specter of climate change hanging over us. Bill McKibben writes his book in 1989,
Yes.
The End of Nature. It starts coming into, I don't know when, it was sometime in the 90s when I first started to understand climate change, and things changed.
They did.
They thought, oh my goodness. It was one thing, not that we didn't live with nuclear destruction, not that we didn't live with other forbidding, but this specter seems more spectral.
I share that sensibility. I wrote a book of nature essays in 1995. And when I look back at them, I think about them with a great fondness because they're the last things I wrote that I wrote from an era of innocence. And at that point, everything changed, and it became unconscionable to only write in celebration of frogs while frog species were disappearing. And it became simply impossible to write about celebration of a marsh when you know the marsh has maybe a year to live before the bulldozers take it out. And then climate change, species extinction on top of this. So we're really having to think again, what's our work in the world? How can we be most effective? How can we do our work in such a way that our children and our grandchildren can look back at us from the future and say, you did a good job. Not only did you do the best you could, you did even more than that. That's tough.
It is tough. One of the things I so like about this festival is I feel there are a lot of people who are doing the best that they could. I feel that, and we bring them together. I feel they feed off of each other, and I feel they put wind in each other's sails, and they
do.
And I think that's a really nice thing to gather these people.
And the other nice thing about it is that I go to hundreds of climate conferences, for example, and they're dominated by the scientific voice and the technological voice, where they're using a very small part of the human mind. They're using the analytical, observational data collecting part of the mind. And what's so fantastic about mountain film at Telluride is that the people here are using their whole capacity, all the capacity of the human mind to create and to imagine, to grieve, to celebrate, to feel ashamed, to blame, all the things that we can do with our minds. And then all the media that are here too, the film, the cameras, the video cameras, the poets, the writers, the artists, and then the mountains themselves, which are a source of strength and ideas too.
They are.
Yeah.
They are, and I always really encourage our guests to get out in them. And I hope you've had a chance, whether walking the river trail or go up to Bear Creek or whatever there is. I've got a lot of people bikes. Saying
that's nice of you.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to go to see our movies. I think it's really important to go see the speakers. I think it's really important to get into these mountains, and we're just thrilled to have you here. I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
And I hope you've enjoyed mountain film as much as we've enjoyed having you here.
I certainly have. It has opened my mind and my possibilities in my world, so my thanks to you.